Makapagpatayo ng sariling bahay. Tsaka po magandang pamilya, hindi po naghihiwalay.
Pangarap ko lang naman po yung pagtapos lang naman po siya. Tapos kontento na po ako doon. Yung napag-aral lang po namin siya, yung maging masaya lang po siya. Habang lumalaki, kontento na po ako doon. Gusto ko po siyang maging seaman. Kasi yun po yung pangarap ng papa niya.
A parent's dream for their child. Jerry Lee, born July 27, is a 100 millionth baby. The head of the Commission on Population says a growing population is both an opportunity and a challenge for the country. It highlights both the challenge of providing opportunities to more people and the opportunity to take advantage of a larger workforce. The government must now make the right investments in its people. That includes healthcare, education, and productive employment, factors that will help fuel equitable growth. And while the government is in a position to institute reforms in pursuit of inclusive development, there remains a challenge in ensuring that the benefits of development will be broadly shared among the population, that no one shall be left behind. 100 million Filipinos are now counting on this.
Thank you for joining us on this fifth and last episode on NEDA's updated Philippine Development Plan, which is supposed to fulfill the hopes of Jeannie, April, and Jerry Lee. Over the past weeks, we've talked with cabinet members and other government officials in charge of infrastructure, competitiveness, accountability, climate change, reconstruction, and the environment, local government officials dealing with the environment, rice, the budget, and the implementation of the president's priorities. We've also talked with representatives from business, a Mindanao-based agribusiness representative, labor, and students. Tonight, we look forward with one of the country's most promising industries, tourism. With us as well as the World Bank's lead economist for poverty reduction in the region. The World Bank last week issued its latest report on the Philippine economy. And of course, Secretary Arsenio Balisacan of NEDA, the co-producer of this series. Let me begin by asking you, Secretary, next week the government releases the second quarter results, GDP results. What can you tell us now about that, how that number is going to look from 5.7 in the first quarter? Will it be more than 5.7%?
That's what we are hoping because we are sticking to the growth rate of 6.5% to 7.5% for the full year.
And how confident are you that we will still meet the full year target?
We are quite confident. In fact, as the export growth was quite high in June 2014, it's about 21%. The industrial production also turned out to be quite good. 13%.
Electronics as well, very strong.
Yeah, so we are still quite confident that we will hit the target.
Now, in your Philippine Development Plan, which I have here, two things have changed, I think, since you put it out. Aside from, or three things. First of all, there's the 100 millionth baby. Second of all, there's a line in the report which says that the president's ratings remain high, and government credibility remains strong. And there's also a line where you say that the economy is targeted to track higher growth in 2014 to 2016. And the numbers you have are 6.5% to 7.5% for 2014, 7 to 8% next year, and 7.5% to 8.5% in 2016. With the slowdown we had in the first quarter and the problems or the challenges we're experiencing now, are we still on track to those numbers?
I believe so. I don't think that there are fundamentally the macroeconomic fundamentals haven't really changed that much, apart from the uptick in inflation. But even that, we're quite confident that that's a temporary thing. We know where that one is coming from. It's coming from some supply bottlenecks, but we are addressing that properly, and I do think that those growth rates are still within reach.
Roger, let me ask you. The World Bank released this report last week, and here you talk about the jobs challenge. The jobs challenge that's in front of the government during this administration. I think it's 14, it needed to create 14 million jobs. Are we on track to addressing that problem?
I think you are. I think also, if we talk about lowering growth forecasts from 6.6 to 6.4, those are really marginal changes, yeah? Because if you're in that neighborhood, 6%, that's extraordinary, yeah? To give you an idea, if you grow at 6% for 10 years, you will double per capita income, yeah? If you grow at 6% for 20 years, you will raise it fivefold. And for a generation, 30 years, 12-fold. So definitely, this is a very good neighborhood to be in when it comes to growth rates. So I think that's, and it looks as though the Philippine economy has really structurally changed from maybe a growth rate which was considerably lower than that in the last decades to one that's now structurally higher. So I agree completely with Sec RC that that sort of growth level is quite good.
I've been talking about structural reforms over 20 years as a reporter. I'm not sure what structural reforms means. You're talking about structural changes now that are putting us on a higher growth path. Could I ask the two economists, what are the main structural changes that have happened that are going to put us on a sustainable path? Secretary.
One is that we would want to see that the composition of our employment would move from low-paying, highly unproductive, highly seasonal, to one that is more high-paying, higher quality jobs. And that would usually come when the economy succeeds in moving from largely agricultural, largely informal sector to one that is, say, industry-based, manufacturing-based, more productive employment, services sector, and that's the sort of things. Of course, structural issues will also involve reforms that would have to be done to get the economy operating efficiently, because to move and sustain to a higher growth and to sustain that growth in the long term, we need to have that growth founded on productivity. And productivity doesn't come out of nowhere. You have to work hard on that. We have to do a lot of reforms, policy, institutional, legal, and so on. And we need to improve the quality of our workforce by education. We need to invest in innovations, in research, those kind of things that in the end will have to result in higher productivity growth.
Roger, what structural changes have happened that are going to put us on this higher growth plane?
Well, I think what RC is talking about is about this move from agriculture to manufacturing to services. And that sounds quite simple, but it's actually quite difficult to get right. And if you look at the history of the Philippines, you know, that movement hasn't been quite right. So usually the story is this: agriculture starts growing, and with agriculture I mean a large mass of smallholder farmers. They make some money, put that, and they're going to spend that money locally. They create sort of a local manufacturing capacity, yeah? And when that local manufacturing capacity then hooks up with export markets, it becomes this jobs machine, yeah? And then as wages go up, you move out of low-wage manufacturing into services. That's, you know, that sounds simple, but it's very difficult to get right. For instance, you need to switch people. First, you need to have people make money in agriculture. And I mean smallholders. So they need their own plots. They need secure property rights. They need to be able to market it. They need to have access to markets. And then as they make more money and as manufacturing takes off, they need to be able to have the health and the education to move to the city and really learn a whole different set of skills. So you need to invest a lot in health and education, yeah? And then as you move from simple manufacturing to services, you need to really know what IT trends are and what things are different. So I think the Philippines is sort of lagging on agriculture, yeah? So a lot needs to be done there, starting with giving smallholders secure access to their own plots. In manufacturing, the manufacturing is starting to show some very good signs now, but it has really been languishing for decades, yeah? And with manufacturing, I don't just mean large firms, but I mean especially the small firms that are linked to these large firms. So if you look at how easy it is for SMEs to set up a business in the Philippines, compared to the rest of the region is very, very difficult. And then you need to, where you're actually doing very well on is the high end of the service sector. So the business process outsourcing sector is, you're a world-class industry. But, the argument in our report is that that's great and you should keep on pushing that. But without these others two pulling their weight, agriculture and manufacturing, you'll never produce the number of jobs, the 14.6 million, that you're gonna need.
That's not going to come from services like tourism?
Tourism could be a great boon, but remember, even if you look at the impact of tourism on the local economy, it's again farmers who will benefit a lot if they have the plots, if they have the wherewithal to produce the food that the hotels need.
What kind of employment is being generated, Secretary, in the tourism sector?
Well, you could describe it, Coco, as coming from two places. First, there is everyone's traditional notion of employment in the tourism business, hotels, transportation, etc. And then there are the unconventional sources, jobs that were not there before. I always like to say, boatman in the underground river is a new job altogether. It did not exist before. Butanding guide or caretaker is a new job. So almost by definition, if you will, some people in fact have described tourism, because it is rooted in the natural resource, as the new agriculture. And in a way, you can think of it that way because the talent to do it, the skills to do it, is latent in almost every Filipino. And what we're trying to do is to increase the opportunities for them to participate. As the President himself pointed out, tourism is low-hanging fruit as far as inclusiveness is concerned, precisely because you don't need a college degree to participate. We are actively engaged, in fact, in very serious infrastructure programs, roads, bridges, that will allow the poor, the poorest communities in the Philippines, to connect to tourism growth areas. This is a very significant development. And when I'm asked about inclusiveness and employment, I always say the best way to describe how tourism makes that happen is to use some very simple nouns and ideas. Remote islands, caves, mountaintops, underground, over the ground, under the water. These are not traditional areas for growth and employment. Now they are.
Is the target still 10 million arrivals by 2016?
Oh, absolutely. The bad news for everyone in charge of infrastructure is the President and I are not budging from that target. Now, remember, the target is based on our notion of what the capacity should and could be within the next 2 years. The latent demand for the Philippines is well over 10 million arrivals. But I should hasten to add that there are three very important metrics, and arrivals are really, if you will, is really just one of them. And in a way, the least important. The second is the revenue you get per tourist. And the third is the employment. We are on track as far as revenue is concerned. Very few people know that last year the Philippine tourism industry reached about $4.3 billion US just for tourism. And employment is now just a little over 4.4 million direct employment. So it is very serious business now. It used to be a mom and pop operation. Tourism was something other people used to do, but it is now a very serious industry in the Philippines. And I'd like to think we're going to be good at it.
You mentioned that the 10 million target is bad news for the people in infrastructure. But in a sense, they're also bad news for you because they haven't delivered, have they? You were talking to me over the past few years about them promising you X number of airports that can take international landings. Have they fulfilled that commitment, for example?
I think an economy and a government coming out of where it was in 2010 should have and does in fact expect that there will be bottlenecks. This is actually evidence that there is tremendous potential and tremendous growth. You wouldn't have asked me that question 5 years ago. Of course there's congestion in our airports because we're using our airports more and more every day now. Will we cope with it? We think so. That's why the Philippine proposition is you have, granted, you'll probably spend an hour and a half or 2 hours in an airport that should be improved, but 4 days in a fantastic beach. I suggest that's a better deal than a fantastic experience at the airport and a bad beach. Okay, and one of these days, Coco, we're going to fix our airports, and we still will have fantastic beaches.
I'm glad you brought up bottlenecks, and this is a question for all of you. And Roger, you and I have talked about this several times. The solutions are clear. People know what the solutions are. There's a variety of them. You can almost pick them off the shelf. I've been reporting on the same ideas for years. Why does it take so long? You're an economist. You're formerly from the private sector. Why does it take so long for these simple ideas to be implemented?
Many of those projects are at various stages of development, so that it doesn't. The perception is that not much is moving, but actually a lot of them are in various stages of development. It turns out that many of those big infrastructure projects require a lot of preparation time, including just the bidding alone takes. But what is not often appreciated is that actually the infrastructure program is more than just PPP. What you, Coco, and many others are closely watching is the PPP, but the biggest part of the infrastructure program is with DPWH, and that is has been doing well, especially in rural areas. Many of these improvements in infrastructure actually is, unfortunately, it's outside of Metro Manila, and you see much more improvements in rural area.
Secretary, these projects that you want implemented, for example, making this airport able to take international flights, why is it taking so long? What do they tell you at the DOTC, from the DOTC, for example? Why does it take so long to implement that?
Well, first of all, I think
why can't you or the president tell them get it done within 6 months?
No, I think to be fair to the president and to me, we tell them this every day. Okay. And he at least twice a day. But there are realities precisely. First, the legal complications that we inherited, given, say, NAIA. But again, there is a tendency to overlook the other significant developments that have been happening in aviation in the Philippines. We are no longer laboring under a perception called the FAA downgrade. That's been lifted. We are no longer laboring under the perception of a European blackball or downgrade. That's been lifted too. We actually faced a torrent of objections to the pocket open skies. We are on open skies. We have probably refurbished at least 11 provincial airports. We have completed through the DOTC the bidding and the planning for the new Cebu International Airport. And when that opens, that's going to be a real game changer for us. Clark capacity is twice what it was when we started. And we are on the verge precisely of finally licking the problem in NAIA. It took a little longer, but that's what people were watching. They didn't see that in the interim we had built 2,000 kilometers of tourism roads. Roads that were non-existent before, connecting to waterfalls, to beach fronts, to volcanoes, to lakes, etc. 2,000 kilometers of it have actually been built in the last 3 years. And that's in a convergence program with DPWH. If you look around you, even in the city, there is tourism infrastructure. Ross Boulevard is now undergoing the much-awaited facelift. We're going through that as we speak. And so is Rizal Park and Intramuros.
I'm glad you mentioned open skies somewhere there. And I'm glad we're having this discussion today, because just this week, AirAsia, Tony Fernandez, is complaining again that his planes are not being allowed to fly into NAIA. And in his words, he said something to the effect of, he thinks that the big local airlines are pressuring the government to keep him away from NAIA. It's one thing to implement road projects, etc. There's another situation where there's strong lobbies in the country that keep out some ideas or liberalization. Don't you see that?
Well, actually, it's not my place to announce it, but I think if you spoke to the DOTC now, some very significant new policies will change that very radically in the coming weeks.
Roger, when you look at the different countries that you've studied and been in, how debilitating are these lobbies that prevent simple ideas from being implemented?
Let me first say that this is my 12th country. And I think every secretary or minister I've talked to, when they assume office, the same day they realize how little power they have. Because it takes so many other factors to come together and so many actors to work together. It takes a coalition to get things done. Take the tourism sector, to get the connection between the airport and the hotel. That's just already an infrastructure issue, going through many spheres of government. I went to Balair last week. Stretches were fantastic road, and then suddenly I'm on a dirt road, and I'm thinking, and by the way, Balair is a fantastic surf spot. That's the spot where
I saw your pictures.
Apocalypse Now had this famous scene where the U.S. sergeant said, let's surf here. And then the other said, but aren't you afraid of the Viet Cong? He said, Charlie, don't surf. It's a fantastic spot, but just to get there is still an issue, because it takes so many people to work together. So it takes that in government, a coalition, and strong leadership definitely helps. But then it takes this coalition with the private sector, with farmers, with business. And there is where, where this issue comes. At some point in time, can a nation really come together? Stakeholders that might usually be at loggerheads with each other or fight for their own private interest, can they come together and realize that if they work together, the pie will actually grow a lot faster and a lot bigger than if they each defend their own turf? But the natural reaction is for people to defend their interests. So the natural reaction is to say, I don't want to open up, even though we know that opening up an economy in the end will be good for everybody. It's sort of that political process of forging coalitions to get to that higher goal and higher vision. That's the issue. And see, when you're growing at 6%, it's actually very difficult to do, because things are looking great, and the coffers are full and everything is being done. It's actually much more difficult to reform and get those sort of really structural, difficult to done in good times than in bad times.
So you want there to be a crisis?
I'm really hoping for a crisis. But I think the crisis that we want is the crisis that this is the time to do it. All the stars are aligned. We have a great leadership, a good cabinet, many people in the private sector and labor who are seeing the same thing. We're feeling good about the country. Now is the time to sort of say, listen, let's forget our vested interests and look beyond that. Because we'd love to continue growing at 6%.
We're going to take a short break. ANC presents Philippine Development in Focus. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're still with Economic Planning Chief Arsenio Balisacan, Tourism Secretary Mon Jimenez, and the World Bank's Roger Brink. Secretary, you were talking to us during the break about how tourism is now that convergence that you're seeing now.
The approach that SecMon has taken and that we in government has subscribed to is to develop or to pursue convergence efforts in tourism development. That means that we can't have all the cities and all the towns presenting themselves as tourism development areas, right? Instead, given the scarcity of resources, what Department of Tourism has done is to focus on one or two per region and fully develop these tourism destinations, getting all the major departments, from the public works to agriculture to DOTC and so on, even the schools, to converge in those areas so that we'll have a far more interconnecting activities and linkages among those activities are enhanced so that inclusive growth can actually happen in those areas. I think that's quite an improvement in the way we develop tourism compared to what we have in the past.
Could you give us a good example of that, Secretary?
Well, one of the best examples, I think, would be our continuous development in Boracay and the way we have managed the participation of the rest of the province of Aklan. The improvement of the road infrastructure that actually allows the larger population in Aklan to participate in the growth that comes out of Boracay. In fact, if you look very closely, it is very obvious now that in the next 2 to 3 years, the tourism will spill over finally into the mainland, into Aklan, where areas like Navas and Calibo will begin to participate more directly in the growth that Boracay has started. Boracay is now considered a self-sustaining party island. It's still a party island, but we snatched it from away from the cliff that would have led to its own destruction and managed to refocus everyone on sustainable tourism. You have communities in Aklan that are now contributing to crafts and souvenirs creation, the delivery of services, etc. And what you're going to see is that Boracay tourism will eventually become tourism growth for the rest of Panay Island.
Let me shift a little. While we've been doing this series, the issue of rice and food prices has really come to the fore. There's been a big increase since the middle of last year. Once again, for years we've been talking about how to reform the NFA, how to abolish and change the NFA structure, how to open up and liberalize the rice trade so that cheap rice can come in and Filipino consumers can benefit from that. Why is it so difficult to get that policy right or to implement that policy?
The recent price spikes that we have seen is an outcome not only of current policies, yes, but also the disruptions of supply chains associated with the many disasters that we have had last year that affected rice growing areas. But at the same time, responsible agencies in government overlook the extent of those disruptions. And so we had to do some reforms, do some changes in the way we undertake this business of importation, this business of determining production, determining imports, and so on. And the whole idea is that we must balance the interests of various groups while we are looking at the interests of farmers in terms of the impact of high prices on them. We also have to be watchful of the bad effects of high prices and poor consumers, especially that since staples like rice can have serious repercussions on the rest of the economy.
Roger, is the conflict between the rice farmers and the consumers, or does it lie elsewhere?
I don't think so. I think we can protect or help farmers and consumers at the same time. But I think the current policy in which basically government manages the importation of rice, that's risky business. So if you look at the July inflation number, it comes out at 4.9. 3.2% of that comes from food, and within that again 1.3% comes from rice. And since rice and corn sort of move together, you could say that basically the entire upswing in inflation in the country comes from the rice prices. And that is so because, you know, rice is something that the majority of the people need every day. So whatever the price, they will want to buy it. Meaning that if there's only a little shortfall, if we get the calculations just a little bit wrong, then the price just shoots up, yeah? And that's next to the supply issues that Archie mentions. I think the main cause is this fact that there was a shortfall, and that immediately, you know, prices then shoot up. I think the policy then should be to import rice as fast as you can. Yeah? And I think to pit that against farmers and say no, but you know, farmers wouldn't want it, I don't think that's quite right. I think first of all, most of the poor farmers have already locked in the price of rice. Yeah. So if you would import now, they wouldn't be hurt by it. Then probably what you would want to do is help preserve farmers' profits. So help them with farm-to-market roads, help them with extension, help them with research. I think there can be a lot done, even as you lower the consumer price of rice, to make sure that farmers' incomes stay the same or even better. Yeah? So I think the focus should be how do we help farmers best and how do we help the poor best. I think the current policy is doing neither.
The reason I asked this question, Secretary, is as you've both pointed out, it's an issue that affects so many people. If, first of all Filipinos eat rice. Second of all, the farming community is a large community. It's a big part of the inflation figure, and therefore a big part of the economy. And we've been talking about the solutions for decades, or at least a decade, and it's not in place. The reason I ask the question is, as a prism to, why is it difficult to get good policies in place?
We do made the decision to improve the way the market works in the context of rice. So we have talked about in the cabinet and made the decision that we should let those prices predictable by importing when we need to import. And again, the question there is really the volume and the speed by which you can bring that import. And I think that we would want to see a reform this process to eventually lead into a more predictable environment for the rice sector.
In some way, is this the kind of crisis and are these the kinds of solutions that you were talking about? The need for a kind of a crisis to get to some solutions?
I think so, yeah. I think that's why people are talking about it, thinking about it, and that's just what is needed, that people really look at this and trace out the best policy going forward.
One of the topics I wanted to talk about during this whole series, Secretary Jimenez, was education and training. And you were talking about how important, of course, human resource is in your industry. Yes. We're implementing a K-12 program, which is supposed to produce talent that can go to work by the end of the K-12 program. How are you finding, and the BPO sector has raised red flags about the lack of qualified personnel. How is it in the tourism sector?
Well, first of all, in the tourism sector, we are actively engaged, and in some cases with the help of the World Bank, in training programs to precisely shore up the supply of skilled workers coming into tourism. There are very specialized needs for the tourism business that have to be addressed, that are not normally addressed, especially in the trade level, or shall we say at the vocational level. We are therefore also converged with the TESDA. There's a lot sharper matching between the industry's needs now and what they offer at the TESDA. Once upon a time, we threatened to have more bartenders in this country than any other country in the world because we just tended arbitrarily to train people with, oh, we have a facility for training bartenders, let's train bartenders. And now there
like
is
to
a
drink,
convergence with the tourism industry and the Tourism Congress of the Philippines, which is a private sector organization, to specify and work with TESDA so that we are able to identify all these areas. Now, the other side of that is the quality or the level of training. And this is where we are getting a lot of assistance from friends like the Canadian aid groups. They are all helping us identify new standards of quality training that were not there before. Guiding. We need a lot of that. We now have courses for guiding. Even skills such as executive housekeeping are now being trained, not just in the universities, but in the countryside. And then there is a program for homestay, teaching people how to run surplus space in their homes as accommodation facilities, explaining to them that tourists prefer their towels white instead of multicolored, etc. Believe me, you have to explain this to a lot of people, and so on and so forth. This is all, if you will, again, to address in a more formal way demands that are cropping up only now, because it's only now that we are treating tourism as an honest-to-goodness industry.
Roger, in the World Bank report, you have a whole page of what ails the Philippine education system right now, or where its shortcomings are. We are, as we said, implementing a K-12 program, Secretary. What kind of priority is the government pushing behind that K-12 program?
The issue for us is not just about increasing the number of years, but even more important is the quality of education in each of those years. And so therefore the challenge is and the inputs that you need for those additional years, the curricula, the teachers, the classrooms, and so on. But also, more importantly, to ensure that the quality of skills and the kind of skills that are developed along the way matches the skills that are emerging in the market. I think that's the big part of our problem in this lack of inclusiveness or the weakness of the economy in generating jobs. I think that the K-12 has to better fit of what the industry needs and what our school system supplies.
When I was reading the statistics that you put forward in the report, which I think I've heard or read in different places, but somehow when I read it there, it just broke my heart. The number that shocked me was in 2000 numbers, we're spending 5,000 plus, 5,000 pesos plus per student per year. Right. That's all we're spending.
Right. But since 2010, this government has doubled spending on social services. And the way the fiscal management is going, the fiscal space is there to continue that. Yeah? So in terms of the inputs, getting the budget resources there, I think the track you're on is absolutely good. Now, but to get good education, both Secretary Mon and Secretary Archie talked about it, you need to sort of have a partnership with the private sector. Yeah? I'm very impressed with how the business process outsourcing is doing that. So that's an industry that's growing at 20% a year. They can't afford not to have the college graduates to man and their industry. So they have this partnership with 20 colleges in which they help with the curriculum, and that sort of partnership is partly funded by the industry itself and partly by the government. So that's in terms of to eradicate that skills match. Yeah, work with the private sector because they know what they want. And these are, by the way, very basic skills. This is reading, writing, listening, communication. And then earlier in life, it's parents who know whether their kids are learning something. Yeah. So you know, the more parents get involved with the schools, the more influence they have over what's happening at the school, the better. That comes very clear from all the countries in the world which have good school systems. So partnerships, coalitions again maybe, with parents and with the private sector. The resources, the fiscal resources, you have now.
We're going to take a very quick break. This is ANC Presents Philippine Development in Focus. Welcome back. We're still with Economic Planning Chief Arsenio Balisacan, Tourism Secretary Mon Jimenez, and the World Bank's Roger van den Brink. We're going to take questions from the students in our audience right now. Since we left off with tourism and education, AJ, you have the first question.
My question is regarding the jobs that tourism generates, because last year we had the privilege of meeting up with farmers from Aurora Casiguran, and they were farmers from the APECO, the special economic zone, and they told us na, well, one of the things that the government was offering them was they would give them jobs related to tourism. They would train guides and different things so that they could have opportunities for employment. However, they told us that, well, that doesn't work for the older generation because they're only educating the younger of their group, and it doesn't work in the long term because, for example, the lands that they used to have, that they used to till, they're not able to access that anymore, and instead they have to resort to like short-term employment for tourism. So my question is, how sustainable do you think the tourism jobs are when it comes to indigenous people, or for example, those who were previously employed in agriculture? So it's for Secretary Jimenez.
You mentioned a while ago that tourism is in a way the new agriculture.
And therefore it means that success is determined largely by the attitude and the activism of the people on the ground. Tourism is not something that you direct from on high in the national government. The national government, AJ, provides the tools, the encouragement, and if you will, the part of the demand. But the actual tourism infrastructure, the ability to respond to that demand must come from the ground. The most successful tourism communities in the Philippines are led by the people in those communities, by the people in Panglao and Bohol, by the people in Cebu, Mactan, etc. It is where people are very focused on the tourism that they succeed. If you sit in a chair and expect the national government to actually hand you a tourism opportunity, it probably will not happen. Now, you've just heard a while ago how beautiful Baler is. In fact, how beautiful the province of Aurora is. Certainly there is there is tremendous potential there. And we can, in fact, drive traffic very actively towards that area. The question is, will people come together and decide that tourism is going to be part of their future? I can't make that decision for the people because it would be phony. And yes, you are implying that there are certain issues within the community that have to be settled. But I assure you, a community that decides that it's going to embrace tourism will have a place even for older people. You should go to Bohol and you'll realize that the older group is in fact very much engaged.
Roger?
Think of Switzerland. Yeah? So those Alps, they were the property of the herders and the farmers of the Swiss villages. They owned it, and they have owned it since, since the 1200s, since written records were kept. When skiing started, it wasn't somebody coming in and taking away their property rights and establishing hotels. These were the communities, the villages themselves, who became the owners of the hotels, the lift operators. And now, they have co-ops running the ski slopes in Switzerland. Those models in which communities really benefit from the natural resources, in a sense, because they own them and can manage them, those are very successful. Yeah? The other model in which outsiders come in and take over things and start running it and hiring the locals to clean the rooms, that's not sort of the type of tourism that the Philippines wants.
Because we're talking about infrastructure, Bianca, I think you have a question about that.
Hello, I'm Bianca Soriano from De La Salle University. So about infrastructures being built not just in the urban areas but also in the rural areas. In these rural areas, it is inevitable that there are indigenous people. My question is, in building these infrastructures, can the government confidently say that we have fairly negotiated with these indigenous people, and have we included them in our tourism plans?
I guess that goes to both secretaries. Secretary Arce, do you want to start?
We have in our system, in our processes, proper consultation, proper engagement, working with the affected stakeholders, including the indigenous people. In fact, we have Indigenous Peoples Act that govern how we proceed in relation to infrastructure development, and so they are taken into account in our infrastructure development program.
Secretary Mon, you must run into that situation a lot.
Yes, it's a difficult problem in many areas, but there is always a middle ground and a happy solution. Very few people know that there are indigenous peoples in Boracay itself, that tiny island. And very recently, excuse me, in convergence with the DILG and other civic groups, we started and helped to start the development of a village for the Ati tribe. And we're finally able to get them to secure. The government stepped in and identified and drew a line around their community, because there were private groups that were trying to claim their land. And if you go to Boracay now, there is an Ati community. There is an Ati community center and a school that is being built. It can be done. Now, the problem, of course, that we faced when we joined government is we realized a lot of the land in the Philippines isn't really as well defined or mapped, because the cadastral surveys have taken 100 years or so to make, and therefore it is not clear. You would have people presenting themselves as indigenous peoples, okay, with a wristwatch shinier than yours and mine, and saying that this belongs to their family. And theoretically, the entire Philippines probably once upon a time, belonged to some indigenous tribe. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to sort out exactly where these remaining areas are, so that we do not, in fact, trample on the rights of people who have legitimate right to them. It's, I think it's difficult at best, but it is as we have illustrated in some areas, solvable.
Because education is one of my top 2 topics aside from rice. Soj, you have a question about education.
Hello, I'm Soj from Ateneo de Manila. And since earlier we were talking about things like the growing population that we recently hit our 100 millionth baby, as well as talking about educational reforms like K+12, my question now is, can the government say that the current reforms being undertaken in the educational sector cater to the growing population, in the sense that you will not be sacrificing quality just because there's like a huge population that is bearing the Philippines?
Secretary.
I think if you look at the since 2010 at least, this level of spending we are providing for the social sector, particularly education and health, you'll find that the rate of growth there of spending is much higher than the rate of growth of your population. And the whole intention is really to reverse the trend that we saw the decade before, no? Which was, as pointed out by Roger earlier, deterioration in the state of the human development formation in this country. And with this huge importance given by this administration in human development, as you see in the share of an increasing share of social services, particularly again health and education, in the total budget, that we believe would change the picture of human development in this country. Of course, not in the near term, but we should see our people, especially if these are continued in the next several years, more competitive and or at least equally competitive as those in our neighbors, as was pointed out earlier. Our neighbors are investing aggressively in human capital formation, and we must do that if we play our cards well in competing and getting our industries, getting our people jobs, and get them out of poverty.
This ties in precisely with our last question about long-term planning. Sunshine?
Hi, I'm Sunshine Mendoza from FEU. Okay, you've told us that we're on the right track for economic growth. However, aside from boosting our strategic infrastructure to boost infrastructure spending and for development, what are the policies or plans of the government for long-term benefits of long-term in nature?
Before you answer that, Secretary, let me ask Roger. You've looked at many countries. What is the value of a long-term plan like this or others that you've seen in other countries, something this thick? What is the value of that?
I think the value of the plan is zero. The value of the planning is a lot. So thinking through it, yeah, together with all stakeholders in government, outsiders, thinking about these long-term issues together. That process is important. The plan is probably out of date the moment it is at the printer, but it's the thinking behind it and the process behind it that matters.
Could you tell us, Secretary, how you come up with a plan like this?
Well, I completely agree with Roger here. That a plan has no value if it's not well informed by evidence, by experiences, by science. And I can assure you that this plan has gone through quite extensive consultation, review of our experiences, amassing as much evidence as we can get in the history of not only of this country, but the history of many nations, and what it takes to address serious poverty problems, serious unemployment, underemployment problems. And to get the economy, or any economy for that matter, to sustain over the long term a high growth, there's no other requirement than raising productivity. You need to get overall productivity rising, productivity growth rising. And for one to do that, you would have to have a good understanding of what has constrained a country from achieving rapid productivity growth. And I do think that given all the researches, not only by the World Bank, but many institutions, including those in the Philippines, we do think that we understand where those sources of productivity growth, in other words, what the critical constraints to high productivity growth are. Number one that has become very clear is the very inadequate infrastructure development in this country, which has led to the very high cost of doing business. Number two that comes out in many of this research work is that the regulatory structure that impedes efficiency, that makes the high cost of doing business or gives rise to high cost of doing business in this country. The third is the quality of our institutions or governance. These three are usually the most serious constraints to high productivity growth, to long-term sustainable development. And we do think that this government has seriously addressed and are addressing these problems. In the case of infrastructure, as I said, we cannot understate the importance of rapid investment in all kinds of infrastructure, you name it, from roads to bridges to airports, flood control, irrigation. But a lot of work has still need to do with improving the regulatory structure of this country, so that we can reduce substantially the inefficiencies. For example, we have heard of cases where in the past you would need more than 100 signatures to start a power plant. That should not happen, because if that's what dominates the system, then you'll never get into a high productivity growth that we would want.
Thank you very much, Secretaries Balisacan and Jimenez and Rogier from the World Bank. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for watching this final episode of Philippine Development in Focus, a co-production with the National Economic and Development Authority. I am Coco Alquaz. Good night.